Today we're going to be talking about understanding HDR TVs, and there's going to be a lot of tech talk in this one. It's going to be a little technical, but I'm going to do the best I can to get through as much information as possible. So smack a like on this video because we're getting to the point right now. The first thing when we talk about HDR TVs that we have to understand is we have to understand the TV eras. There's no way we can possibly get this information out without first understanding the following. When we talk about TV eras, we're talking about time frames that TVs rolled out and what they really covered color-wise. BT601 was the color space that we were in back in the 480p age, right? So when you were watching your old DVDs, you were on a BT601 or Rec 601 television, right? Then enter HD TV, which are TVs you're upgrading from now. We were in BT 709 or Rec 709, right? That's what we're trying to upgrade from. Now in this new age of UHD TV, we're seeing so much that hasn't happened in the television world, where we're seeing new forms of gamma transfer functions, we're seeing new forms of color spaces, and a lot of new just niche jargon and technologies coming out, and it almost seems like every other year they're coming out with something. So the color target that we're at now is DCI-P3 and BT 2020. Well, the thing is, you kind of can pick and choose, I suppose, which one you like. And I know this is going to be a very weird concept, but both of those color spaces are backwards compatible with SDR content. You do not need HDR to be able to achieve BT 2020 or even enjoy BT 2020. It is not necessary. Now, we're going to have to go a little bit more in depth in that because that can confuse some people. What exactly is HDR specifically? HDR stands for high dynamic range. We hear it all the time, but what is high dynamic range? Well, high dynamic range simply refers to stops of dynamic range on a grayscale, typically known as exposure value. And essentially, what you're trying to do is get the most details in your areas leading up into black to prevent crushing in your shadows. You're trying to have something called middle gray as, perfectly opened up. You have all the information in your midtones or middle gray. And then in the brightest part, you have no clipping whatsoever and you're not blowing out highlights. And to do this, you need multiple stops of dynamic range or exposure values or different levels of exposure to open up dynamic range, creating a higher dynamic range. This technology 100% does not require a specialized television. That is why I call it a scam, because I use this technology regularly and show high dynamic range content and imagery on SDR displays all the time. You do not need to treat people like idiots, but most people aren't aware of these terminologies, which is the point of this video today, to try to correct some of that. The reality is, when you talk about high dynamic range, they really try to throw a lot of different variables at you, but let me throw something at you probably haven't heard before. There's something called the logarithmic method. And that sounds very confusing at first, but essentially it just means you can use log footage to obtain the more stops of dynamic range and the exposure value when creating your content at the camera level before rendering it out to source devices, i.e. your phone, your console, your television, so on and so forth. You can create that high dynamic range with those log formats. So whether it's S-Log from Sony, Canon Log from Canon, obviously, ARRI Log, whatever manufacturer has any variation of their log footage, that is high dynamic range. And you're using that high dynamic range, again, without any need for any extra color science, really. You don't have to go to some wide color science if you don't want to. You can actually still use high dynamic range in Rec 709, BT 709. You absolutely can, right? All you're doing is trying to retain informations in your highlights and in your shadows and in your midtones. That's the whole purpose of HDR. This concept of tying it directly to color space and directly to more complicated terminologies is why we are where we are right now, where people not really understanding HDR. Now, let's look at something else that gets a little more confusing. You have the UHD Alliance that came out in 2016, I think. I believe, 2016, they all got together and, it was a bunch of corporate companies, right? And they created this basically round table of, so-called experts, that basically manufacturers trying to create a standard for something that didn't exist at the time so that you would buy. But the reality is, when you look at it, the UHD certification for a UHD premium display is pretty straightforward. So they had it broken down into tiers where you had one that was not qualified as one, like it's not a UHD premium display. You had premium, and then you had advanced premium, right? So at the non-qualified, you're basically disqualified display kind of options. You had basically low quality, a low-priced UHD pseudo 4K kind of panel, and of course they called that the RGBW panel, if you would believe it or not. And it didn't hit all of the points that you needed to have that they were really pushing at the time. Which, of course, if you wanted the premium version of a UHD certified display, you would then have to have a standard dynamic range. You just had to have standard dynamic range. Didn't even have to be anything special. You'd have to have sRGB color, which, again, in all intents and purposes, you just need a basic color, and color accuracy with a delta error of 5 or lower. So you didn't have to be anything fantastic or spectacular to be a premium UHD TV according to the UHD Alliance certification program that they created. And then, of course, everybody went crazy because then they started talking about advanced premium, which was high dynamic range, which is HDR. You had wide color gamut, which was entry level DCI-P3 at the time, okay? And then you had advanced color, which was basically, delta error accuracy of 3 or lower, and then you had excellent video processing, the top of the line best video processing that you could get. And so now in today's consumer market, which is why all this information is relevant and I went over it, is because going forward, all of the companies have just kind of adopted the advanced premium as this is a 4K set. This is what it means to be 4K. You need HDR, you need wide color gamut, DCI-P3 at least, you need a color accuracy of a delta error of 3 or lower. In a lot of cases, they try to do that. And you need to have some form of the best video processing ever. And if you pay attention to the way TVs are marketed now, every year they're going to come out, they're going to say, oh, we've got this brand new processor, because they want to be able to say that they're a UHD certified TV. They're going to talk about wider color gamuts, how many billion shades of color they have, right? And how every year it gets better for you, even though it really kind of doesn't. And then they always talk about HDR and high dynamic range. Even though all of this stuff is really just a marketing ploy that was created by the UHD Alliance as a certification criteria to kind of stay in the big boys club. And so the reality that people think that good UHD TVs nowadays have to have every single one of those things, or have to meet some sort of weird criteria that the UHD Alliance set forward, is just ridiculous. And I think if you understand the UHD premium certification, you can kind of understand it a little bit better. And then again, there's that conversation that we were talking about when we talk about color space. They're talking about DCI-P3. Now, BT 2020 right now is the closest consumer color space to the human eye. Every single color space, when you look at a CIE color chart, is literally derived off of human vision. You're going to have the big giant color, like it's not really a triangle, but for all intents and purposes, we're going to call it a triangle, right? Even though it's not. It's the big color triangle, rounded triangle, if you will. And then in the middle of the triangle, or somewhere around the triangle, you're going to have a tinier triangle inside of that one. And of course, that always represents the limitation of current display technology, always incapable of matching what we see with our human eyes. So when people come out and they say things like DCI-P3 is more accurate than BT 2020 color, they're absolute morons, because BT 2020 is the closest color that we have right now to our human eyes. Now, every TV manufacturer has some form of BT 2020 color coverage. Some can hit 70%, some can hit 80%, some even down in the 60s. Some don't have hardly any support for it. But there's no denying that there are benefits of using that color space, which I've shown on this channel before. And because it's such a wide color space, and sometimes on limited displays, it does produce unflattering, overly red results if you just leave it that way and don't try to tune it down. You can go in and adjust things from there. And my point being is that when you look at everything as a whole in the TV market, the way that they sell these TVs, it's very misleading. There's a lot of terminology that they use, like HDR effect from LG back in the day, HDR plus from Samsung. I'm pretty sure at this point they realized they were confusing people and they pulled those features right as those features started to become understood and easy. But the reality is, when you talk about all of this conceptual stuff of like, HDR is better than SDR, it mind boggles me, because people really don't understand that like the HDR that they're talking about is just a UHD Alliance propaganda tool used to sell televisions from the biggest corporations and manufacturers that are poised to profit off of your investment into those technologies. And so hopefully by making this video, it inspires you to do a little bit more research into this topic and to understand the history of where these terms are coming from, what all of this is all about. I mean, there's so much that I could go into, but I really don't have the time. Few people probably even made it this far in the video already, and there's still so much that we have to cover that we haven't even touched on. So hopefully this helps you guys out. Let me know what you guys think about videos like this in the comments down below, and what you think about this information. And as always, I want to thank you guys so much for watching the #1 brand in honesty and being a part of the community. Until the next video, I'll see you guys later.